Israel is preparing to carry out a ground offensive in Gaza, but there are concerns about what will happen to those captured by Hamas. With Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu facing growing public anger, will the Israeli military go in regardless of the risks? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Under bombardment for more than 2 weeks, the Gaza Strip is bracing for an all-out Israeli ground offensive. The Israeli military leadership has declared its operation will be like no other, promising victory over Hamas. But others fear the lives of those captured by the Palestinian armed group are in jeopardy. The US is reported to have urged Israel to delay its attack in the hope of securing the release of captives held by Hamas. We'll go to our guests on our panel in a moment, but first this report by Qassam Sharif.
Israel's leaders say they will wipe Hamas off the face of the earth. And these are some of the forces they intend to use.
It will take 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and at the end there will be no more Hamas. Before Hamas contacts our tanks and our infantry, they will know the shells from our air force.
Hundreds of thousands of Israeli reservists have been called up to join a planned ground offensive on Gaza. And the US is expanding its military presence in the Middle East in support of Israel. The army conducted ground offensives in Gaza against Hamas in 2014 and 2019. Back then, its aim was to punish and diminish the armed group. But now, the army wants to go further.
We will turn this equation 180 degrees. The day of the attack will be remembered as the day that started the final and complete destruction of the Hamas terrorist organization.
But while the Israeli army steps up its preparations and bombardment of Gaza, it faces challenges at home. The families of 222 captives being held by Hamas since it attacked southern Israel nearly 3 weeks ago are calling for their release.
Where are you? You must understand. It's crazy. We are in hell. In hell.
We are in hell.
And we want our lovers back home now.
2 American hostages have been freed under mediation by Qatar. The army says it's conducting raids to find out where other captives are being held inside Gaza.
These area raids are inside Gaza, and with close contact, we search locations and seek information on the missing and hostages.
Ahead of the ground invasion, more than 1 million Palestinians have been ordered to move south from the north of the Gaza Strip. The Israeli army is warning those who don't will be considered terrorist supporters. While a humanitarian crisis is unfolding in Gaza, many are concerned a major battle between Israel's army and Hamas forces could draw in countries in the region and even global powers. Qassam Sharif for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our panel of guests to discuss all of this. In London, Yossi Mekelberg, Associate Fellow in the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House. In Birmingham, Scott Lucas, Professor at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. He's also founder and editor of EA WorldView, a news analysis site. And also in London is Roxane Farmanfarmaian, Professor of Modern Middle East Politics at the University of Cambridge. Hello to you all. Thank you very much for joining us. So let's talk about the possibility that Israel is under pressure to delay its ground offensive. Starting with you, Yossi. From what we hear, now the problem with discussing all of this is military plans are secret, but from what we hear and the reports we hear, Israel has already delayed this several times.
Correct. And in a way, we found this sea of bad news. It might be actually good news that there is a delay in the military operation because we know exactly what the consequences, or we think we know the consequences of such a ground offensive that's bound to cost many, many lives. And I think there are different reasons for that. A, Israel relies on reserve service, on reservists, and to mobilize. Right now, there are 300,000 mobilized. It means they need to be trained, they need to be equipped, they need to be ready with whatever they are asked to do with the mission itself. And this takes time, especially there are also tensions and more than tensions in the northern border. Then, of course, there is the international community. The pressure is mounting because we see the level of casualties on the Palestinian side, mainly of civilians, how it's going to affect the region, how it's going to affect American interests in the region. And let's not forget, we think, at least for now, there are 222 hostages. Only 2 hostages have been released thus far. And everyone is worried that if a war in a ground offensive starts, these hostages might be used as a human shield anyway, caught in the war. And as a result of it, we don't know what's going to be their fate. So there are a lot of reason actually also to think what is the political aim of such an affair. If at the beginning the Israeli government talked about the elimination altogether of Hamas, if this is actually a viable plan or the result without killing thousands and thousands of innocent civilians, or there needs to be a much more limited plan, strategic plan.
Roxane, when we saw President Biden go for his very brief visit just to Israel last week, yes, everyone focused on how supportive he was of the Israeli people and the Israeli government, but he did say in that speech, do not rush to war and avoid the mistakes that the US made in 9/11.
Well, yes, I think it was clear that he was certainly in the behind the scenes as well, one would imagine, presenting an alternative view that although he was supporting Israel's right to protect itself, he was clearly putting brakes on exactly how Israel would go about that, saying that there would be implications if it approached it in the wrong way. And I think we're seeing the response across the many capitals in the world, including the Arab world, that there is an alternative perspective on this, that it is against international law, of course, to forcibly move people and to attack a whole community as going on in Gaza. And so I think there is definitely a degree of caution that the Israelis are having to build into their plans simply to avoid being further isolated at the end of this. And I think their initial program that they set out was very much simply looking at retaliation. And now they're having to look at the end game.
Scott, we hear from reports that it's actually the main conduit persuading Israel to slow down is the daily meeting between the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and his opposite number, the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who seems to be the most hawkish of those in the military leadership. And the reports are saying the reasons, and Yossi's already mentioned some of these, are those that are being held by Hamas, the need to get more aid into Gaza and to protect US interests in the region. Do those sound like the reasons why the US would be urging caution at the moment to you?
I think the line which has been leaked to the media by American and Israeli officials, that it's primarily because of those 222 hostages, about 50 of whom are foreign nationals. I think that's actually just simply a convenient pretext for what has been the line, not just of the U.S., but of much of the international community since very soon after Hamas's mass murder of Israeli civilians and foreign nationals. And that is, there's a twofold message here. And I think it's important to emphasize that the first part of the message, not just from the U.S., but from European leaders, from leaders of other parts of the world, including Asia and also Latin America, has been, look, Hamas crossed a line of acceptability when it carried out those mass murders. It can no longer be treated as a legitimate leadership in Gaza to provide stability and security. But that leads to the second part of the message, which has been the one which has been given repeatedly, and not just by Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken, which is, as Roxane was pointing out, how do you get rid of Hamas? How do you achieve this aim of removing this leadership that's committed crimes against humanity without alienating and indeed, of course, carrying out mass killing of your own, of Gaza's civilians? So I do think the emphasis was for Israel to not carry out a ground offensive. And I think Israel was on the verge of that ground offensive last week. I think it's also for Israel to limit the bombing, which it's shown no signs of doing so far. So there's less of a success here. But that brings us to that point you raised, which I think is now the key, as it were, both symbolic and political point, and that is getting humanitarian aid into Gaza. The argument of much of the international community is you have got to get some space between Gaza civilians and Hamas. You've got to get civilians away from the idea that Hamas is their only protector. You have got to give them an alternative. And for that, you need not just a few dozen aid trucks going in. You need hundreds and indeed thousands of trucks to be going in, and going in very soon.
Yossi, I'll come back to the aid in a moment, but on the issue of those being held by Hamas, we had 2 Americans that were released. But actually, it's interesting, if you look carefully, the estimated numbers being held have actually gone up. They originally were about 150. Then the estimate a few days ago was 200. I believe it's now more than 212. Now, that, of course, greatly limits, doesn't it, any possibility of a rescue operation, given that these people are probably all held in different places under heavy guard, and some of them probably in a maze of underground tunnels.
Yeah, we are talking now on 222 families that were told that there are family members that are held hostage. And yeah, this complicates everything. It also explains part of the anger. Those are not only soldiers. We're not talking here about prisoners of war. We're talking people being kidnapped, civilians from very, very young age, babies, children, all the way to 84, 85 years old. And it's almost impossible to have a concerted operation to release all of them. It's not realistic. They are by now probably dispersed. And obviously, considering the way Hamas behaved thus far and the atrocities it committed, to expect it not to use it human shield would be only wishful thinking. So the best way forward is actually through quiet negotiation behind the scenes. The Qataris already showed that they are capable of putting some pressure, or at least negotiate the release of 2, and we need to see what happens next. But yeah, this from the beginning complicated any idea of a military operation, because it's put them under immediate risk.
Scott, 2, as we said, were released. Judith and Natalie Raanan, an American-Israeli mother and daughter from Illinois. The fact that Hamas released them when they did, how does that complicate things, do you think, for the Israeli government and the push towards a ground offensive? And actually, adding to that, why do you think, and I know it's pure speculation because we don't know the reasons, they did decide to choose 2 healthy Americans when there are so many elderly, young and infirm people among those being held?
I think the indications are this was a public relations move. It was a public relations move, first of all, to try to deter an Israeli ground invasion by holding out the idea that the hostages were there, and that if you carry out these piecemeal releases, you keep on pushing the invasion back. In other words, as Yossi just pointed out, these hostages are human shields. Let's call it for what it is. Secondly, why was it the Americans? Because the Americans are perceived by many to being the key factor in terms of their influence upon the Israeli leadership, that although there are many others who've been going in to Israel in the past 12 days, the Germans have been going in with Olaf Scholz and Annalena Baerbock. The British have gone in. The Greek prime minister is there today. It's still the idea that Washington is the biggest lever on Israel. So you play to American public opinion. American public opinion, which has felt a great deal of anger over the mass killing of not only Israeli civilians, but at least 31 Americans. You play to Americans and say, look, we're the good guys here. We're willing to release hostages. And by the way, if you attack us, it'd be a shame if those hostages wound up getting killed.
And Roxane, Hamas also, a Hamas spokesman, said that they had the intention of releasing 2 more people, and they named 2 Israeli citizens. Prime Minister Netanyahu's office said this was mendacious propaganda, but this causes big problems, does it not, within Israel and Israel's leadership as well?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that Hamas is playing its cards very carefully, and I, agree that first to Americans, then to Israelis. This has all got an agenda to appeal to not only public opinion, but also to show that there is total control over these hostages at the moment. And I think the Americans were hoping that there would be quite a few Palestinian Americans that would be let out across the Rafah border, which is where the aid trucks are coming in, and that there might be a somewhat of an exchange there. And that has not happened. So it shows that the release of the hostages still is very much up to Hamas. It feels as it's showing it's got complete control over the situation. And I think it's also showing that the Israeli army does not, because their intelligence has shifted consistently as to how many of the how many hostages there are. We don't know if they have any idea where these hostages are. And I think that's possibly very much affecting their decision to go in, because an urban guerrilla, man-to-man fight in Gaza could really be very risky to the lives of hostages that are there. And I think there has been quite a bit of talk about negotiations would certainly be a better way, would be a better guarantee to keep the hostages alive rather than a ground operation, and that certainly would put their lives at much greater risk. So I think it's an interesting chess game that we're seeing here.
Yossi, in terms of those two that were released, the American-Israeli mother and daughter, we haven't seen them since they've been released. I would assume, tell me if you think I'm right, that they have been checked over by doctors, by psychologists, and now the important part for the Israelis and the Americans, they're being debriefed for intelligence.
You're probably right about all of that. We have to remember there's two civilians that went through a terrible ordeal for more than 2 weeks. And yes, first of all, to ensure that their well-being comes first. But yes, if those, whether the Americans or the Israelis would like to know as much as possible out of them. But again, I doubt if they know too much or enough to help the intelligence community in terms of where the other hostages. The time that has elapsed, the 2 weeks, would have probably helped Hamas and Islamic Jihad to put the hostages in different places, because they are waited. And as Roxane said earlier, they are waiting right now for the Israeli forces to enter and then fight door to door in urban areas. There are tunnels there are bobby traps and the rest. So whether there is information that two hostages that they were released can help the intelligence community, I'm not so sure about that.
Scott, in addition to US citizens, there are citizens of the UK, France, Germany, Netherlands, Thailand, Argentina, Germany, France, I said Germany twice, sorry, Chile, Spain and Portugal on the list. Now, these include some of the US and Israel's closest allies. How much pressure do you think is coming on the Israelis from these governments?
Those governments will again be part of, what is a collective effort, not just simply a U.S. effort, not just to emphasize that the lives of these hostages are at risk if there's any type of ground operation, but I think to put across the wider message, which is, look, even if an Israeli ground offensive is put off for a week, 2 weeks, another month, it's quite likely that Israel will be carrying out the air operations, the sustained bombing. And I think the message there is, again, to the Israeli leadership, well, can you really think that you can bomb Hamas out of existence or even contain it? Do you think that bombing and flattening Gaza and killing thousands of Palestinians is going to make any advance on releasing the hostages? I mean, I'll just put it to you like this, James, and that is that, in a sense, Hamas knew when they attacked Israel that they would invite the Israeli retaliation. Their plan was always going to be to use not only the hostages, but Gaza's civilians as hostages, a wider set of hostages, because of that Israeli attack. And so now those civilians are being held hostage effectively by Hamas and by the Israeli leadership, and the the international community is trying to find a way to break that, trying to find a way to break the cycle of violence and try to shift the priority to aid rather than talking about a ground offensive or continued aerial operations, including, the proposal, which the U.S. may finally sign on to in the Security Council, to make a pause in the conflict and humanitarian operations the number one objective.
Roxane, when we saw the two Americans released, it was just hours later that we saw the very first and there weren't very many, there were only 20 initially, trucks of humanitarian aid cross into Gaza. Do you think that was a coincidence or part of the deal?
One would imagine it was probably part of the deal. The low level of aid trucks that have been allowed in since, I think, are hinging on the negotiations to release this next two set of hostages. This, we've got to remember, is massively lower than the amount of aid that was coming in even prior to the whole conflagration that began on October 7th. There were hundreds of aid trucks that normally would come into Gaza. And so it is really suffering without these. So both sides are pulling those ropes in the negotiation. And so I think they are linked. And I think that there is also some degree of, I would agree with Yossi, I don't think there's a great deal of information that the hostages are going to be able to provide, simply because I would also imagine that those hostages that are being released are probably ones that are quite close to the place where they're being exchanged. So I think they're being kept probably specifically out of any kind of massive movement or loop of Hamas activities.
Yossi, a great deal of pressure on Israel to let in more aid, but one specific item which has not been allowed in until now, which is fuel. And of course, fuel is needed for all sorts of things, for water sanitation, water pumping, desalination. UNRWA, which is the UN agency that deals with the Palestinians, says it's going to exhaust its fuel reserves in the next 2 to 3 days. Hospitals rely on generators. One very disturbing report from UNICEF suggests there are about 120 babies in incubators who would die if there was not fuel to power those incubators. Do you think Israel will let fuel in or not? Because it's described as a dual-use item.
Well, along the years, there were many other commodities were defined as dual usage. But at the end of the day, we are talking about the life of many civilians. There are 2.2 million people living in this highly populated place. It's a tiny territory. And they are relying for water and electricity to a large extent on Israel. And entering, as we just discussed, there are 20 trucks won't make a huge difference. You need hundreds of them every day for humanitarian aid. And UNRWA, for years, actually, teetering just on the verge of collapse, not being able to supply the basic services there because of cut in aid. When you have such a crisis in the middle of war, there is need even more aid. And if this is stopped, the end result of it is inevitably is increase in suffering of the population, including deaths, premature deaths of many. I think while Israel has the right to fight against Hamas and against terrorism, it doesn't have the right at the same time to deprive innocent civilians from their very basic rights. Eventually, and we already see more than 4,000 Palestinians killed. So there must be a way in which, and it does mean that also some of the operation might be delayed, but it needs to find a way in which there are humanitarian corridor, there is way for aid to come in, and also that electricity is provided and fuel is provided to hospitals and to school and other places. Yes, we know Hamas is not going to fight in according to the Geneva Convention, but Israel is a democracy, as President Biden suggested. Democracy should conduct their wars differently.
Now, the other question I want to ask you is where international diplomacy is going, because you'll be aware that at the end of last week, the US ambassador in the United Nations put her hand up and vetoed a resolution that would allow humanitarian pauses to be put into effect to try and deliver this aid. The US seem to be changing their position. They put forward another draft resolution, which I was told in something I saw from the UAE, which is also on the Security Council, that they put a submission saying that that draft from the US was severely unbalanced. Well, this I've obtained is the new US draft resolution. And for the first time, they mention exploring additional practical steps such as humanitarian pauses and the establishment of humanitarian corridors. Roxane, Israel's not going to like that, is it?
Well, it's interesting because I think the accompanying story to this is that Biden had been working on Netanyahu for some time to convince him that the larger picture has to be the right for Israel to defend itself, but the secondary picture has to be that it be according to international law and to conform to protecting civilians and the Gazan people, Palestinians. And so I think I'm not totally surprised that it's taken this this first step where the U.S. was extremely tough and rough in saying that that there was going to be absolutely no ceasefires and that it was vetoing these UN resolutions. But now it has obviously convinced Israel that a different step is important to take. I think the situation we have to recognize is very fluid. And the longer the time goes and the longer that this incubates, it's clear that humanitarian support is absolutely critical to this and is critical to the image that Israel will have coming out of this story. And if it is not able to allow this kind of humanitarian help, it will be increasingly isolated as it comes out of this with none of the work it had done trying to shore up any kind of relationships with its neighbors. That will all be completely...
Let me just stop you there briefly. We're coming to the end of the programme. I just want to ask each of you, very quick, two-word answer, yes or no. Is there going to be a ground invasion? Is the pressure on Israel going to work? Yossi?
To some extent, I expect one to take place.
Scott?
Israel will divide this into two parts. There'll be a ground invasion to establish more of a buffer zone in northern Gaza Strip, whereas in the southern Gaza Strip, the emphasis will be that civilians can go there and some humanitarian aid can give them some support.
Roxane, quickly, yes or no?
I think there will be. I don't think it can back out at this point.
Have to end it there, Roxane. Thank you to all our guests, Yossi Mekelberg, Scott Lucas and Roxane Farmanfarmaian. If you missed any part of our discussion, you can always watch it again anytime on aljazeera.com. If you have your own views about anything that was said, post a comment on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or on X, the one that used to be called Twitter, we're at AJ Inside Story. Comprehensive coverage of the Gaza war continues on Al Jazeera around the clock, and I'll be back in this chair very soon. From all the team, stay safe. Bye for now.